All right. And if everything went well, yeah, we're live. Well, welcome to the show today, Sohan.
Thanks for having me, William.
Yeah, great. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Everything Outside Code, where I talk to a fantastic creator, founder, GTM expert, developer advocate about the really difficult parts of going to market, right? I'd say building a product. And today we're talking about a very interesting topic, which if you've been building with AI and agents, especially from like the infrastructure side, you've probably been thinking about, and that's with authentication and authorization in general. Basically, how do we get two agents to communicate with each other without having a lot of hassle with signing up and like verifying that whoever or whatever entity is getting access to a resource, they are who they say they are, right? So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And Sahan has a wealth of experience as a developer advocate. You know what? I'm just going to shut up. But if you have any questions, put it in the comments. I'll let Sahan do the talking. Welcome to the show, man. Could you tell us a bit about how you got here and the famous line, how you got to being a developer advocate and developer on set?
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks for having me, William. And yeah, so
Mhm.
my name is Sohan. I'm based in the Netherlands. I do DevRel at the startup called auth. We're a very small company, but I'd like to think we're punching above our weight because we work with a lot of enterprises on their authorization challenges. I've actually been in the DevRel space, I think, for 11 years now, which is quite a bit. I've done DevRel in startups like Fermion and Gupshop before, but also spent 6 years at Amazon, both in the Alexa team, where I did early AI stuff, and also in the AWS team, again, where I was DevRel. And way, way, way before that, I started my career building mobile phone apps, and this was way before it was cool. In fact, some of the older folks in the audience might remember when iOS had Objective C as their programming language. This was way before Swift. If you use Swift, I'm sorry, you're not as cool as the OGs who used Objective C like me. But that was how I started my career. And yeah, I just at that moment, there was not much in terms of like blogs and videos, and even Stack Overflow was newish. So I enjoyed the aspect of sharing what I was learning because it was so new back then. I'm talking like 2010, and I started writing blogs. I started contributing on Stack Overflow and forums, and I enjoyed that aspect with the technical part of building apps. And I came across this very, very new role back then called developer evangelist or developer advocate. And I applied for one and I really enjoyed it. And I've been in that role ever since. So that's the short version, I hope, of my story.
Yeah, that's amazing, man. Um, so you were working in AI before it was cool.
Yeah.
That's what I got, right? What's that distinction now? Like, what's the difference then versus now and the work you did? And you pretty much worked on, I'd say, fairly complex systems for the time, like working on something like Alexa that had some speech recognition and could parse that information and return something back. Maybe not as intelligent as it could be now, but what's sort of that distinction with what we had before versus what we have now?
Yeah, and yeah, so again, to give you a bit of background, in 2015 or maybe end of 2014, I started working in this startup based in India called Gupshop, which is still around doing very well. And we essentially were trying to build chatbots back then, and it wasn't as easy to build it as it is now because of the natural language processing or NLP models that you had to build. They weren't as intelligent. And from there, I moved to the Alexa team. And I worked there, built up the Alexa ecosystem in and launched it in India, etc. The one big turning point, which we all know, was I think in about 2018-19 with the launch of this one white paper. It was a scientific paper called "Attention is All You Need." And fun fact, it's actually named after the Beatles song "Love Is All You Need." That's a different story, but the whole point was, I think, like 6 to 8 scientists in a university basically figured out a new way to do machine learning, right? Using this thing called the attention mechanism. Things were done slightly differently back then, but they used this attention mechanism, and the architecture was called a transformer. And that was the game changer, right? And in fact, the T in ChatGPT stands for transformer, because ChatGPT was one of the first, widely adopted tools to use this new architecture. So before that paper, you had to use very complex machine learning and natural language processing tools like BERT and few other models, which were good, but they weren't nearly as good as what we chat with every day in ChatGPT and Claude. So that was the turning point, because after that, the interface became conversation, right? Before that, you were very much trying to fight or almost, like trying to figure out how to talk to an AI and how to get the right intention and right entities and all of that. But then it really moved to being able to communicate with AI using natural language. And William, I know if you're like a science fiction fan, TV shows, books, whatever. I am. The dream of any sci-fi in the 20th century was this ability to communicate to a machine. So I think that really changed things, after that paper. And I'm sure all of us here use, conversational AI on a daily basis now.
Yeah. I think about, do you feel like the end state for AI would be conversations of some sort? I mean, like conversations as we know it now, maybe conversations of some sort. There's always going to be communication, right? But do you think it's going to be conversational as we know it today? Just random thought
Yeah,
out
no,
there.
at a very philosophical level, if you sort of look at what are the things that make us human, this ability to like talk, listen, and comprehend is generally considered like an important thing. And again, if you like read science fiction and books and stuff, uh, that is considered like, this huge advancement, or you anthropomorphize things like a machine or whatever. And now
Mhm.
suddenly it's easy to do that. You can slap an API or a chatbot or just talk to Claude or ChatGPT or whatever. So it does feel like we've gotten to like this huge leap in, like this technological advancement journey that we've been doing for the last whatever 1,000 years. So I see it as like a pretty big leap in tech in general.
Yeah. Well, I guess until Elon makes like makes put chips in our heads and we don't have
Yeah.
to speak, we don't have to speak, and we can
Yeah.
just have thoughts.
Yeah.
You get thoughts and things happen with
Yeah.
Neuralink. Then maybe that is a future that we
That
get
is.
to
Yeah. Yeah.
eventually. Um, because speaking about authentication, right?
Mhm.
In the past, we know authentication as first it was username and password, right? That's what it was from the early days of like AOL and having like a Yahoo Mail. That's what it was.
Yeah. Password
And
one two
then
three.
exactly,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And then we had captures to protect systems from bots and computer use, right? Because then we had bots. Now all the bots have become agents, at least. Um, we moved from that to when we started thinking about infrastructure, right? We had APIs. At least as I became a developer, I learned there was something called APIs that let two systems talk to each other without the need for the traditional username and password. And so long as I had an API key, I was good. It was sort of like a key that would unlock messaging between both systems. That's been for a long time, at least for the 2000s so far, or as far as I think I know, the standard, right? What you see a next step for that looking like? You work in authentication and authorization. Have you started thinking about as we move to more and more like agentic future where all bots are now allowed, right? Or at least some bots are allowed. Have you started thinking about what authentication look like? Do we still should we still have a distinction between bots and agents, or it's just humans versus computers at this point?
I think the last statement you made, right, I think is the telling one, which is what are we authenticating and authorizing against when it comes to an agent? And the answer in the industry right now is we simply don't know. There is no standard. I think in the past we have had like, okay, this is a standard, this is a spec, this is a protocol, and we're going to do something, and then the industry adopts it. And Sometimes maybe there are competing protocols, and eventually one becomes standard. You know, right now we are at that space where there isn't that one standard. So we might have like A2A or agent to agent protocol. We have MCP. We have agent context protocol. Like all these different protocols, no standard. So we're simply, as an industry, I think, unsure of what the perspective is, right? So let's take an example of an agent. What are you authenticating and authorizing this agent against? So is it the user, where an agent impersonates me? That's one thing. Is it the agent gets all the permission the user has? Sure, that's another approach. Is it this agent needs its own user and identity and permissions, which becomes an entirely new problem on its own? We don't know, right? So there are all of these like very open-ended questions, and I feel maybe we're not talking about it enough. But I see maybe in the down the line in the future some sort of standardization in like protocols and the fundamentals, which give us a solid like view into, okay, this is what it's going to be. But the answer as of today in 2026 is, I think, we simply don't know, or we are figuring it out.
Yeah, like I strongly share the same opinion because at a meetup recently, I asked Matt Billman, is the CEO of Netlify, if we're going to make a standard for agents, because we work in developer experience, right?
Mhm.
A huge portion of that is access and authentication. There are actually startups dedicated to that, like Auth said.
Yep.
So I thought
Yep.
about, like, if we're going to make a standard for agents to communicate, what would that look like? Because I know there is that future, right? And
Hmm.
then someone on the side, also part of the conversation, chimed in and said, maybe we don't need a standard, right? But I just mentally cannot comprehend why or what a future without a standard would look like. People are
Yeah.
usually, at least right now, folks say the agents will figure it out. There's that notion of maybe we're
Yeah.
overcomplicating things. Just ask the agent and it's going to figure out how to do it. But the more the hops it takes an agent to figure out how to do it, the more resource and tokens it consumes. Again,
Yeah.
which brings me back to maybe we do need a standard so the agent actually knows what exactly to do. So, have you
Yeah.
thought about this world of just letting the agent do stuff rather than trying to box it in and give it like a sort of, maybe not rules, but guidelines it should follow?
Absolutely. And let me give you an example of why this is not a great idea, right? And this is from the industry I work in. So, but it is a very real use case. So, authorization is like an important thing in the industry right now. So, for those of y'all who might follow OWASP, or Open Worldwide Application Security Project, this foundation that looks at security risks for web apps, their last two lists, and these lists come out every 4 years, their last two lists have been topped by broken access control as being the number one risk to web apps. In fact, the previous list came out a few months ago. And here's a scary fact, William: 100% of the apps tested had access control issues, right? So not 90, not 80, 100%.
100.
And yeah,
Wow.
now take that thinking that all of these apps have access control issues and pit that against an agent, which, you know, can reason for itself, in which case you might have, or you will run into problems where an agent is like, do I need to check if a user has access to this before giving them data? And if the answer is no, then you have an access control issue, right? Which is why if you have a standard or a protocol saying the agent can reason for things that, like, oh, do I need data? Maybe, sure, that's fine. But do I need to check for authorization or permissions? The answer has to be yes. And if you let an agent reason there, you are opening it yourself up to security issues, as opposed to having a workflow or a path where an agent does some intelligent reasoning for something, but it does like a security thing 100% of the time. So not even 99.9% of the time, 100% of the time, right? And that's where something like a security protocol or any protocol really matters. So this idea of letting agents do everything and reasoning on its own, it sounds great. It sounds very sci-fi. It sounds cool. But when it comes to things like security, you really don't want this to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you're right. Because I know in the same meetup, while we're talking about that, someone was building a dashboard that was just meant to be like a, I'd say, if I was going to boil down the user experience, it's going to be like a Tinder swipe SQ approve versus deny agent actions,
Hmm.
right? So once you do something, you either like you're just approving or denying something, like review it, quickly approve it. So there's always going to be that step in between. But then that step also depends on like human cognition, which is very emotional, right? Sometimes
Yeah.
you feel good about stuff that influences your decisions.
Hmm.
Sometimes you don't, right? And vice versa. But if we talk about standards, so let's say we agree there's got to be standards. In your opinion, if you've thought about this, what does it take to make a standard, right? At least make a standard and then we can worry about adopting it. Or does the adoption of a standard make it a standard? So can someone make something somewhere and then the more people adopt it, we're like, oh, this is the de facto standard, like using
Hmm.
Tailwind for
Yeah.
web UIs at the
Yeah.
moment.
There's a classic. Do you know the comic XKCD? There's a classic
No.
XKCD comic, which it's popular. Like they do a lot of like science and tech type things. It's quite popular. But there's a comic which says, "Hey, there are two competing standards. We need to reunify it. So I'm working on unifying these two competing standards." And the next panel says, "Congrats, you now have three new standards." So I think it's one of those things. Um, I think a good way we've been doing it in the past as a tech industry in general is having things like foundations and open source and consensus and having people from different parties, different stakeholders with competing, interests really sort of come to a consensus on like a standard. And I think the difference has been in the past, it's been like a slower, more deliberate process. Now I feel in the AI arms race, as it were, I think speed is of the essence, and that's how the tech industry is. So, people are putting out like standards. So, three companies get together, put out one standard, or people put out a standard, but say these important parts are work in progress, right? Like to give you an example, and not to call out any people, but just as an example of the standard itself, if you look at the MCP spec, Model Context Protocol, in the spec right now, it says
Mhm.
authorization is up to the developer, right? So it's not enforced by the standard itself. In the
Yeah.
spec, it says, hey, you as a dev, you figure out this very important security
Mhm.
bit, which again can lead and has already led to a bunch of like data breaches and stuff, right? So
Yeah.
I think that's the missing piece. Once these specs, or once we come to some sort of consensus in the industry in terms of security, authorization, authentication, etc., uh, hopefully there's I think a little more tightness in how, like, or at least more clarity, I'd say, in how these agents work and so on.
Yeah. I I somewhat wish there was some sort of like an open AI foundation. Now that sounds like open AI the company. They already,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
guess they already took they
yeah,
took
yeah.
they took
They
the
take
name
the,
already.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. But if there was some like open AI foundation where we can we can contribute to standards like this. They can, just like we had,
Hmm.
like I think it was the web foundation, the web consortium,
Yeah,
right?
W3C.
The
Yeah, yeah.
W3C,
Hmm.
that came up with stuff. And we had like, the
Yeah.
CSS folks and the HTML
Right.
folks that,
Yeah, yeah,
I came up with things and we
yeah,
argued about them and we got excited about some things and we adopted some other things, right? So I
yeah.
wish there was something like that for AI. I don't
Yeah,
know
to
if
be fair, I
there
think there are.
is
There are.
there.
So, like for instance, Linux Foundation, who basically owns, not owns, but they're part of like CNCF, Cloud Native Computing Foundation. So they, I know what the right word, but they do things around like Kubernetes and Helm and all the CNCF products. So they have like an agentic AI thing that they just started this year with, soon to have conferences and monthly meetings and intakes and all of that. Um, I think, was it Google who started the A2A protocol, which is the agent to agent protocol? I know JetBrains plus Z started ACP. So there are like, exactly, right? Like there are some of these standards that are being built out in the open. Um, the convergence has to happen at some point of time where people decide. And trust me, in all of tech, not just like computer tech, but all of tech, there's always been competing standards, right? I think the most famous one was the Betamax versus VHS in the 1980s, where
Yeah,
was it VHS tapes or Betamax tapes? Like Sony and a bunch chose one, like I think Philips and a bunch chose the other. It's always been there. Same with like
yeah,
Blu-ray and DVD and CD. So, but eventually convergence does happen, right? So I think we'll see that very soon.
yeah. Now that's a future I'm looking forward to, especially as whoever is able to get to that, or the faster we're able to get to that world where it's just agent to agents communicating 100%, and as a human you're just a director, and
Yeah.
you're thinking of new ways for them to be better. I think that's the better for us. um well, we've looked at the past and the future a bit. To the present, what's
Mhm.
working at the moment? What is the way you'd recommend folks? I guess there are two categories of people, right? The first would be developers building agentic products, right? That are building products for others to use. And then on the other side, there are folks that are looking to um, use other agents, right? They're building systems that would require agents. We have the same we have the same dilemma internally for context. So Boki is our intelligent content operations platform. We use that for
Mhm.
content marketing internally. Um, and today we're thinking, should we build MCP support, right? But last week, folks were like, MCP is dying. We should use skills. So I'm
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
should we have MCPs or should we build skills? So just in essence, there are two sides of the coin. How do you envision folks should build? Like, how do you recommend folks should build authentication or authorization for agents? You could also share the work you're doing with auth as well, as it supports this.
Yeah, sure thing. I think the fundamental thinking model is to really think about what you want these agents to do. And not in the sense of I wanted to write code and stuff like that. But there are different ways of thinking, right? It could be like a personal assistant like Claude. And if you think about it, if you use Claude Code, William, it actually has way more permissions than it should. It can nuke your computer if, something goes wrong, right? Because it's running outside the trust boundary, so it's pretty much running on your local system. And we have seen lots of posts on LinkedIn about how OpenClaw has done some weird stuff because it went wild.
Yeah,
So it's really running outside that sort of trust boundary. Sometimes it can run inside a trust boundary, like the Vercel agent, where it sort of says, okay, I will deploy this project for you inside of Vercel. So it's within the trust boundary. It has like a very small thing it can do. So I think it should really, anyone building agents should really be like, okay, what is it that we want this agent to do? Where do we want it to run? And who or what are we authorizing it against? Are we saying let it be exactly like the user? Are we saying let it have the same set of permissions as the user? Or, are we saying, hey, let's treat them as their own identity and stuff? I think just giving some of these things some thought gives you like some confidence to be like, okay, now that we know this, we can actually build a system where these agents can do stuff, but in a safe, contained way for our use case, right? And then you can think about using certain tools and frameworks, whatever. Uh, our CEO calls it like falsehoods people believe about agent authorization. You believe that, oh, this agent represents me, so it should be able to do what I do. But that again is a bit of a falsehood, right? Like, what if you say improve the company's bottom line, and it might actually nuke, I don't know, 5 employees from your company? So yeah. So I think
yeah,
thinking about where and how you want to run these agents, I think is step one. And then you can figure out like tools and frameworks and so on.
yeah. Now that's cool. I guess it boils down to like the specification, right, for the agents who's going to use it. Um, I'm just thinking about like future proofing your solution. I guess until we
Hmm.
don't have a standard yet, you're just gonna keep adding support for all the standards until
Yeah.
one becomes the the majority. Then you can take out uh, every other every other thing at the moment. I'm curious, what does auth do exactly? Could you speak a bit more
Mhm.
to that and how you handle authorization in general?
Sure. Our mission is to fix broken access control. That's our mission. So we provide authorization infrastructure for enterprises to run. So we have an open source product called SpiceDB. Again, it's free, it's open source. And essentially with SpiceDB, you can build authorization into your apps. Now, these apps could be any traditional app, like say a financial app or, like a
Hmm.
documentation store or whatever, but it could also be an AI app. And in fact, OpenAI uses SpiceDB to secure their RAG pipeline. So if you've ever used ChatGPT apps, it used to be called ChatGPT connectors, right? So there's a little plus button on your ChatGPT where you connect it to like Google Drive and Dropbox and Box, and you can ask it questions from the documents in that. So that is a RAG use case, right? A retrieval augmented generation use case.
Hmm.
Those things are very popular right now. People use RAG a lot. That's a common AI use case, especially in
Hmm.
enterprises. But most use cases here, someone can ask a question to this chatbot and you can get an answer from data you don't have access to, right? Like
Mm.
in my internal chatbot, I can be like, how much does my CEO make? And maybe I get the answer, even though I shouldn't be able to access that. That's because fine-grained permissions have not been built into this RAG. And I think, again, that's being important. So with SpiceDB and with Outside, you can actually build that sort of permissions. So when I ask a chatbot questions, I get answers only based on the stuff that I have access to in this document store or whatever.
Yeah. Now that is a an area I hadn't thought about, right? Access within content, because so far everyone gets excited about, yeah, this AI can ingest everything. It can ingest
Yeah.
everything the company has, but we forget that sometimes you have confidential information in companies at different levels, right? You need you need clearance for
Yeah.
certain pieces of information. So uh, I don't know. Could you walk me through what this workflow looks like for Spice DB? Just because I'm also curious, and also
Mhm.
for folks building RAG pipelines out there with enterprise data, they also understand how to tier authorization for different kinds of data they're ingesting.
Yeah, so traditionally, right, people used role-based access control to, use this. So everyone, like if I was a user, as I was assigned a role like developer, and all developers could maybe access these 10 documents or whatever. But that stops working at scale, especially when we're talking million documents. And if you add things like 100 AI agents, it gets even more complicated. So the people who actually popularized this new method of access control were Google. So in 2019, they released this white paper called Google Zanzibar. And that white paper describes exactly how Google does authorization at Google scale, right? So we're talking billions of objects, millions of users, every country in the world, etc. And SpiceDB is a faithful open source version of Google Zanzibar. So it uses something called relationship based access control, where there is a relationship between anything. So if say
Mhm.
I have access to a document, there's a relationship between me and that document. If I have access to say a folder, there is a relationship between me and the folder. And if there are documents in that folder, there's a relationship between the folder and the documents. So everything is described as a relationship. And in things like RAG or AI, these relationships, they matter a lot more because there's a lot of context around a decision whether you should give access or not. And turns out reback, relationship based access control, is very, very efficient for something like this because you're representing these relationships as a graph and then you're boiling it down to a graph traversal problem. So if you want to be like,
Mhm.
hey, can William access document one? You just traverse the graph. And if the graph can go from William to document one, yes, William can access it. And that's how, any Zanzibar system like SpiceDB actually does authorization decisions.
Wow, that's cool. I didn't know that. So does the system sit on top of the RAG system? Like, so you have a RAG pipeline. Does it sit on does it sit on the request path, right? Or does it sit on like the return path? So it's like a gate. Is it a gate to allow data not go up, or it's sort of like a filter that does an early return and says like, I couldn't find this data because there isn't a relationship. The relationship broke down somewhere on the traversal.
Yeah, so great question. Basically, the idea is this check should happen before you go to the LLM. So typically in a RAG pipeline, a user asks a question which goes through like a vector database, which has all the information, which then goes into like a large language model, and then you return that back. Right? So there are two approaches. You can do one before the vector database, where you're like, give me all the documents that the user has access to, and then you use that as a filter to the vector database, right? So thus shielding it from the LLM. Or you go to the vector database, get the relevant documents, and then check using some metadata if the user has access to each of those documents. But in both cases, this check happens before the LLM, which is the key, because you don't want the LLM to access this information that the user can't access, right? So when the user asks a question, you can do it before or after the vector database, but both times before the LLM.
Hmm. Yeah, that's great. And this is Spice DB.
Yes. It's on
Yeah,
GitHub,
like,
github.com/authzed/spicedb. If you're a developer, think of it as an API. So every time you have to write a relationship when, like say a user creates a document or a user is added to a document, and for checking, you can just use the API to check permissions again. So it's pretty straightforward.
yeah. I'm just gonna put this in the comments for
Hmm.
anyone interested in checking this out. Because I know for folks building, I think a lot of people building enterprise scale like RAG applications right now, they probably put a gate after inference, right? So after inference, the data that is returned, there's some sanitization that goes on there to extract any sensitive data or check if the user should have access to this data. But then I'm thinking about how difficult it would be to match authorization at that point, and also the cost on performance and the user experience, where the user expects the chat to be fast, but then
Yeah.
it's a lot slower because some JavaScript has to run some check,
Yeah. Yeah.
against the database before returning data. um
Yeah, and most people do just like a row level security, right? You stuff like a row with a bunch of user IDs that have access to a row, which will work perfectly
mhm,
well, and maybe it's quicker to implement for 100 users, right? Or maybe even say 1,000 users. But if you scale to, I don't know, like a million rows, billion rows, or like hundreds of thousands of users, or something to that effect, it really starts breaking down, right? It really slows down your app. You can't scale. It can get complicated, and it's very hard to audit as well if you're an enterprise. So reback, relationship based access control, was essentially built to handle the scale of Google, where you had like super low latency requirements, high availability across multiple regions, global scale, etc. And that's why it works
mhm,
very well for something like RAG. uh, the interesting thing was, this was, the white paper was in 2019. Zanzibar was described for use cases that were not AI specific, but as it stands today, it's probably the best for AI use cases that we have. And it's much better than
mhm.
using traditional role-based access control and so on, or like a policy engine or whatever. Turns out Reback really fits this use case very well.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. I'm gonna personally just check out Reback too, because I've only known RBack
Mhm.
for
Yeah.
regular SaaS SaaS
Yeah.
applications. A final question for me would be, just thinking about this. We've talked about authentication, access, which is access to a platform in general, authorization, access to specific resources within the platform. When folks build out agentic experiences, um, at the moment, that would expose their agents to consumption. Which do you feel holds more weight? Like, which do you feel like they should focus on today? Because we see teams like Resend that
Mhm.
suddenly turned off their bot protection service, right? So bots, humans, everyone can sign up. Basically, authentication is like free. Does this mean they'd have to focus on authorization? Or how do you perceive at the moment with the way things are today? Folks, what should people focus on? Put more effort into authorization or more into like fixing authentication?
I mean, looking at just pure data, right, and not taking my bias into context, access control is such a big problem in the industry. So I would say like fix what your agents can access. To give a framework around that, there's a guy named Simon Willison who was one of the creators of the Django web framework, if you remember that from some time ago. So he coined this thing called the lethal trifecta, right? So he said if you're building an agent, what happens is you one give it access to private data, which is fine, right? Whatever, you're giving it access to data. You also give it an ability to externally communicate, right? So
Hmm.
it can send something to someone, and those two together also may be okay. And then the third part of this trifecta is you give it exposure to like untrusted content, so the ability to access the web. So this trifecta, each of those taken on its own is fine, but if you give it all these three, you're asking for trouble, and things can really go bad. So even that is kind of a falsehood in its way, but I would say at least look at that framework to make sure you're not, exposing your private data externally by building this lethal trifecta without you knowing. And a great example of this is MCP, right? Because the MCP you're building, it's self-describing and self-updating. It can communicate externally, and typically you're giving it access to your private data, right? So I'd say keep that framework in mind, at least, as make sure you're not doing all of those three, because it can wreak havoc both ways. You can get malicious code running in your systems, or your private data can also go out externally, and not a good look.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. That's a great one. Think about the trifecta. Well, in MCP's case, you can just say like just I'd say shift the blame to the developer and just be like, we're not gonna
Yeah.
take care of this piece. You
Yeah.
go figure it out. If you mess it up, that's on you. That's on you, not on us. Thank you so much for coming on, Sohan. This has been fantastic. I think personally I've learned a lot, and I hope folks that tune into this one to learn about how folks are thinking about authentication and authorization for agents, and we all, fingers crossed, look forward to like a standard so we can stop implementing everything across board.
Yeah, thanks for having me, William, and yeah, good luck, and this was a great conversation.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you all so much for hanging out, and that is today's episode of Everything Outside Code, and I will see you on the next one. Cheers.